Hi everyone. It's now the 11th of September, 2021, and of course this day is poignant. It's the 20th anniversary of the famous attacks of 9/11. A day that needs obviously no introduction. Um, I couldn't not make a video about this day because for me personally, just a disclaimer here, I've no actual connection to 9/11. You know, some people say they missed the plane or they were in New York City or something else. I have no personal connection that I'm aware of. Um, but I always find the anniversary moving somehow. And even having never been to New York City, I've been to upstate New York when I visited the US in 1999. But even having never been to New York City, I still sort of miss the Twin Towers. I feel like there's something about that skyline that's missing without those towers. I watched an interesting little clip earlier, which is was exploring why super tall skyscrapers, or rather mega tall skyscrapers, this is 600 meters plus, there's only four in the world, have never been built in New York City and why they probably wouldn't be built. It's not that it's not feasible. The foundations are okay. You know, it's not an earthquake zone. It's not. It would be feasible. But I think one reason, and I knew this even before the guy was narrating this, or rather, I guessed it was the emotional sort of side of that. That those twin towers, you know, there's something forever poignant about them. The new One World Trade Center, I understand, is actually a little bit taller, although it doesn't necessarily look that way. Aesthetically, I think the twin towers look a little bit taller, but this is, you know. But anyway, I've never been to New York City. Maybe I will go one day, and I'm sure that's a very impressive building in its own right. Anyway, not to digress. Even as a non-New Yorker, it just feels like, you know, whenever you see New York depicted, which is often, it's one of the most filmed cities in the world. So I've just been watching Friends, for example. Every season of Friends, right up to series six, you know, at some point depicted the World Trade Center in the background. Any film made in New York City that's, you know, made there between 1970 and 2001, it's always there. Anyway, I digress. I always find that day moving. And the way I would describe 9/11 is it was the event, it was the images that haunted a generation. Um, what I mean by that is not that it only impacted millennials or something like that. Not so much a generation in terms of age, but a generation in terms of a period of time. I mean, I remember in the 2000s, it was a long time when people were talking about, you know, planes flying near buildings and so on. There was definitely, for quite a long time, I'd say a good, at least 5 years, a post 9/11 atmosphere in that sense. And I remember when Al Qaeda was committing its atrocities around the world, there was always this kind of feeling of where will the next attack be? So, you know, there was Amman, there was Sharm el Sheikh, Delhi, Madrid, London, Bali, all these deadly atrocities, and there were others, of course. It was always this question of where's the next attack. So that post 9/11 world was very much a defining thing of the early 21st century, of the 2000s decade. Then in the 2010s, of course, we've had Islamic State extremism and terrorism has continued. Terrorism's been a problem in the world, that sort of terrorism, or rather, terrorism in the modern sense, since probably the 1970s. So, in a sense, it's a relatively modern phenomenon, although there has always been violence, although in the 19th century there was anarchist terror in a sense. I think 9/11 really showed a new kind of terrorism. Terrorism existed before, and of course it's been a problem afterwards, but there has never been an incident like that where you have a large scale attack involving four hijacked planes in arguably the world's most important city, certainly one of the world's most famous cities, um, hitting at the very heart of American power, symbols of capitalism, the Pentagon, symbol of power. Um, it's never happened before or since. Often analogies are made with Pearl Harbor. Well, Pearl Harbor, major event as it was, again, that wasn't even as profound, apart from the fact it brought America into World War II, which was a huge thing. Pearl Harbor, it was a military site, and it was thousands of miles from the mainland. I'm not downplaying it, it was a major event, but I think 9/11 was more profound because the vast majority of deaths were civilian, and the nature of it was unique. There have been terrorist attacks since, but none on that scale. Um, but I think, just the image of those planes crashing into the towers, people falling. I watched World Trade Center earlier with Nicolas Cage and Michael Pena. It's a film I've seen numerous times. Powerful film. I think it was made very well, actually. I think they got a good balance. It wasn't over the top. I don't think it was absolutely too much in terms of sentimentality. It just was what it was. If you haven't seen it, I would look at that one. Um, I'm going to watch United '93. It's a Paul Greengrass film about the plane that fought back. Paul Greengrass, as a director, his style is known for being very intense, and he doesn't use well-known actors, so there's no big names in his films. That gives a sort of realism. It's I'd have to say United '93 might be the most intense film I've ever seen. It's a very, very powerful film in terms of the real time way it's shot, in terms of it's it's a very unique style, very powerful. It's not an easy film to watch, but that's Greengrass's style as a director, and I think it's effective. But I don't think it's disrespectful. I think it's done in a way that is this is the reality, but it's not. I don't think it's exploitative. And interestingly, in both cases, both those films, I understand, well, Oliver Stone made World Trade Center and Paul Greengrass. In both cases, they were careful to work with relatives. That's very important. It's respectful. Um, but 9/11 in terms of the actual toll that we're talking about 3,000 people. There have been bigger events since, before and since. Not in terrorism, but in other events. I mean, far, far more New Yorkers have died from COVID, for example. Um, and there have been natural disasters since 9/11 that have been far deadlier, certainly ongoing conflicts. So, and even at the time, actually, the initial fears were the death toll would be even higher, up to 10, 20,000 dead. So 3,000 is a staggering number, but it could have been even higher, considering how many people worked in the buildings. Um, for me, as a British citizen, 67 of my compatriots died that day. We actually had the second highest, I don't want to put it this way, but representation after Americans. A lot of Indians, Dominicans, but, citizens from 87 countries, I understand, died that day. So it was an attack, in some ways on the world, in that sense. Of course, it was an attack on America, on American power, um, and American symbolism, but it was an attack on civilization. And I don't intend this video to be a very long, in-depth analysis of the way jihadists think or the war on terror or anything like that. Let me just say for the record, though, with all this analysis that's now going on with what's happened in Afghanistan, I believe that intervention in 2001 was justified. I haven't changed my view on that. Recent events in Afghanistan are tragic, but I still believe that in 2001, and people conveniently forget this, there was broad support for intervention. And President Bush deserves plenty of criticism, but I would argue no president before or since has faced what he had to face in that sense. And I do think, looking back, there were some partisan attacks on Bush that were unfair. Often quoted like sitting in the classroom thing. is kind of cited as, oh, well, he didn't care. Well, President Bush has said that he wanted to convey the right tone. And looking back on it, I never really believed that it was like he didn't care or something like that. Um, but Bush is a polarizing figure. And he made some grave errors. Linking Iraq to 9/11 was an absolutely terrible foreign policy approach. I was going to say blunder, but it was, a blunder's a mistake. It was a deliberate policy. And of course, some of the hawks around him, Cheney and Rumsfeld and so on, pushed that. Um, Also, wiretapping of US citizens and a whole range of other things, Guantanamo Bay. I think the Bush administration made some serious mistakes, but I believe it was right to intervene in Afghanistan. Um, A, there was broad UN support, and B, how could Bush have conceivably not done that? The Taliban was a regime that gave Al Qaeda safe haven. And people could say the Americans knew in advance. The Americans funded the Mujahideen in the 80s. Well, the Mujahideen and the Taliban are not one and the same. What happened was the Mujahideen split. Some of them became Taliban, some of them became Northern Alliance. It split. It was a civil war. So that's again an example of history being overly simplified. Oh well, the Americans they funded the Mujahideen, so it's almost it's all I would say it's almost victim blaming. Like they brought this on themselves. I think that's disgusting. Um, but it's inaccurate as well. And I used to like people like Michael Moore, the filmmaker. But looking at Moore now, I think he's actually quite amateurish. What he does is he overly simplifies history. He's very sensationalistic. I think the problem with Michael Moore is he is motivated by ideology, which is fine, but it's very obvious. And the problem with that is that he overly relies on sensationalism, sweeping claims, cherry picking, and that's a serious problem. It misinforms people, and you get right wing equivalents. Absolutely, you would. I'm sure in 2001 and throughout its presidency, there were Bush supporters who distorted things, and that's politics, unfortunately. But getting back to that day, the images are just haunting. Even now, exactly 20 years on, it's it's difficult not to be moved by those images. Even harder not to be moved when you start seeing the individual human stories of the victims. One that always gets me is the Hanson family. They were a mixed race couple, and they had a little girl who was the youngest victim of 9/11. And seeing that picture, it's on various 9/11 memorial sources. Um, Apparently, she had a little stuffed Peter Rabbit in the museum there at Ground Zero. They were on, I believe it was Flight 175 that hit the South Tower. Um, you'd have to be made of stone to see that and not feel moved. Um, and there's, countless other human stories. I've just read one about Daniel Lewin, who was thought to be the very first casualty. He was stabbed on American Flight 11. Um, an American Israeli. He was an entrepreneur and he started a technology startup company, only 31 years old. But, he didn't achieve so much in his life. I'm 36. And, looking at someone like that, it's tragic in one sense, but it's also inspiring that he fitted so much into his young life. And there's countless human stories, there always will be. So it also reiterates, if there could be so many human stories around 9/11, imagine the vast number of stories over, for example, the Asian tsunami of 2004, which, 200,000 plus people died, or the Haiti earthquake, or even bigger human tragedies. But I think that, again, the thing with 9/11 that differentiates it is that it was man-made. I think let's say the Twin Towers had collapsed as a result of gas explosion or something like that, it would still be a huge story. It would still be a tragedy, but there wouldn't really be political implications to the same extent, except maybe around the fallout in terms of architectural design or something like that. Something akin to the Grenfell disaster in London. But because it was man-made, that immediately brought in a political factor, and yeah, it reverberates 20 years later. I don't think those images will ever be forgotten. Just briefly, I bought this book in Waterstones, which is a big UK book retailer, and it was expensive at the time for me. But I'm pleased I bought it because it shows power of photojournalism. It's a book by Reuters, and it's basic photographs around the day. None of them are overly graphic, but some of them are very powerful, and it's just about the day. So it just shows the power of photojournalism. If I show a few of these, well, here's a poignant one. Again, I'll just quote the photographer here, Gary Hirshhorn. Gary Hirshhorn. This is a vigil at one of the fire stations. So no copyright infringement intended. It's photographed by Gary Hirshhorn. I'm not making any money for these videos, by the way. So that's an interesting one. A little rescue dog going into the rubble. And that picture is by a US Navy photo by journalist first class Preston Kerris. And yeah, there's here's another one, Weary Firefighters Leaving Ground Zero. This is by Mike Seeger. Um, there's many others, so just get a few. This one is actually the family of American Airlines pilot John Ogonowski. Peggy Ogonowski, his widow. This is the airline that was American Flight 11, which was flying into the North Tower, I believe. And the photo was by Brian Snyder. Again, just to clarify, I'm not making any money off this, so I don't think that's exploitative. I just think this is a part of photojournalism. Um, and there really are some poignant images of that day. Obviously, if any of the photographers in question see this video and they take issue, I'll remove it. Um, you know, I um, I've given them credit, and there's many other images in this. I won't show others because it'll take too long. But it's a very poignant book, and obviously the initial impact. You know, the aviation was massively impacted. The entire United States airspace shut down. Um, And Canada, this shows the power of international cooperation. Canada, under the government of John Christian, really, worked hard to assist their American neighbours. And it's something I think many Americans respected and know about. Like, they really did accommodate that fallout in terms of grounded flights and so on. In fact, there was a story of a small town in Nova Scotia, just a hamlet really, that's one of the flights was diverted and landed. The entire town came out to help. So there was evil that day, but there was also the best of human nature as well. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. Today is 20 years. I don't know if, as time goes on, when it's 25 years, 30 years, if it's going to become a bit more, well, will be more distant, but obviously not for the survivors. I think the images will always be haunting, always. Um, because it was really the first major event of the 21st century, and it was, I mean, major in the sense of world changing. And it was a time, although it was before social media. I mean, my goodness, can you imagine if 9/11 happened with social media? Then there'd be even more archived. But People had video recorders. There was 24-hour news cycles. The world was at that point, so there was all those archives, and they're haunting. See, I remember watching a report about it was just some local news network, and it was September the 10th, 2001, and it was all these mundane stories like high school football team was in trouble for some wild behavior. There was some stock market reports. It seems so mundane compared to the news that would follow the following morning. So that's interesting. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. If you're a New Yorker, you know, I can imagine this is a poignant day, or anyone, if you happen to come across this and you were directly involved in the day, I hope I've been sensitive in the way I've made this video. But for me, I just find it moving because I was 16 at the time. And it sounds like a cliche. I do remember where I was. Um, I'd been at the museum that day, my local museum here in Sunderland. I'd come home, and my sister was watching the news, and which she didn't do. She thought it was an action film, as a lot of people did. And then it was like I remember for the first time in my life feeling a fear, not about something childish like well, at the time, but it was the first time in my life I felt this palpable unease about something beyond my control, about something happening in the world. That was the first time I felt it, and it was a very surreal feeling. Um, anyway, 20 years on, New York City's still here. You know, over 8 million New Yorkers continue to get on with their lives. It's something that impacted the city deeply, but um, New York's still standing. America's still standing. So that's something to hold on to.